I'd like to introduce Christin. She is a PhD candidate in the English Language and Literature Department, and she studies the evolving nature of internationalization of higher education in Canada and how it impacts the teaching of composition and writing for international students.
Today we're discussing the role of the university in the modern world. Perhaps nothing has come to shape the modern world so thoroughly as globalization, and with it a new era of internationalization. My research studies how this new era of internationalization impacts specifically composition classrooms in Canada. Now we might ask, what is the difference between globalization and internationalization? This is a worthy question. Jane Knight separates globalization from internationalization in this way. Globalization creates the environment in which internationalization is becoming more important and changing significantly. She defines internationalization as integrating an international, intercultural, or global dimension into the purpose and functions of post-secondary education. As such, she writes, the internationalization has transformed the world of higher education. We're living in a new global reality, which continues to unfold possibilities and risks for the future of education in Canada, particularly writing and composition programs. Just 2 years ago, Global Affairs Canada reported that international students brought in $15 billion to the Canadian GDP in 2016. This number promises only to rise, especially in light of reduced tuition revenue this year. Kamal Guruz cites the revenue-generating capacity of internationalization as a major reason why universities recruit and enroll international students, and his research has borne out at this particular juncture in history. Universities across Ontario, including University of Waterloo, are scrambling to meet the tuition shortfall by raising international student tuition and enrolling a larger body of international students. Once these students arrive on campus, universities rely heavily on first-year writing courses to help assimilate international students to the mainstream academic culture. And really, what are we talking about here? We're talking about using writing courses as a way of streamlining linguistic competency. Ira Shore calls this, quote, composition for containment, control, and capital growth, end quote, in which basic writing courses are used as a way of sorting students who don't speak English as a first language. For us as scholars, faculty, and administrators, the question becomes, how can we safeguard the ethos and principles of education so that they are not quietly co-opted by the commercial interests which have slowly permeated this new iteration of internationalization? In other words, is it possible to separate the commercialization of internationalization from the commercialization of international students? This ultimately is the heart of my research. I want to understand how the economic forces behind internationalization may be impacting and influencing the way we teach international students writing. Fundamentally, is this new strain of internationalization changing the way we situate students in the learning? Now, when I say new strain, I'm referring to one of the findings in my research, that internationalization has not always looked this way in Canadian higher education. The truth is, internationalization has a long and storied past here in Canada. Rupa Desai-Trilokekar writes that Canada's relationship with internationalization predates the buzz and spin of modern globalization and its emphasis on economic interests. The roots of internationalization in Canada, she writes, are embedded in a traditional Canadian ethos of anti-imperialism and a need for a just and equitable world order. To what is she referring? Well, let me share with you a little of what I have found about internationalization and how it has shifted over the decades here in Canada, so that we can better understand how this shift might be impacting the international students in our classrooms. Prior to the 1960s, Canada's international relations were closely tied with foreign policies. At that time, Canadian foreign policy emphasized development aid and poverty reduction in developing countries. The establishment of the Commonwealth Colombo Plan in 1950 situated development aid as a key component of Canada's foreign policy. Cranford Pratt described Canadian international relations at that time as, quote, humane internationalization, end quote, guided by this idea that developed countries had an ethical responsibility towards those beyond their borders who suffered from poverty. This bedrock value guided Canada's international relations toward overseas development aid. Through the 1960s and 70s, Canada became one of the most generous donors among developed countries, giving at its peak 0.55% of Canadian GDP in development aid. The emphasis on partnership and collaboration soon spilled over into academic relations. In her research, Jane Knight notes that in Canada, internationalization was originally conceived in terms of sharing ideas, cultures, knowledge, and values. In 1961, the External Aid Office contracted with the University of British Columbia to create a twinning program in a developed country. This was the first of several such programs which invested in partner universities overseas to help them update their technical and professional fields. However, the tides of foreign policy were changing, and in the 1970s and 80s, budget cuts led to a decrease in aid from Canadian foreign policy and began to shift away from poverty reduction to a concern with Canada's security, diplomatic, and commercial interests. It was at this juncture that Canadian academics began to criticize this turn in foreign policy. As a result of their criticism, the government paid attention and created the Academic Relations section in 1967. In that same year, the University of Guelph opened the first international office on a campus in Canada, and by 1979, 37 Canadian universities were partnering with the Canadian International Development Agency for various projects overseas. In the 1980s, the Academic Relations section hit its peak in funding with $20 million for operational funds. With these ample resources, academic relations were able to expand to an even larger number of countries. But by the 1990s, they saw budget cuts again, and a new season of austerity brought their budget back down to $12 million. This season of cuts brought about a new focus for Canada's foreign policy and internationalization, an interest in commercialism. And it's at this point that we see government funding shift away from university-based relations internationally to more commercial-based projects that built relations with emerging economies such as India and China. Funding agencies, which had long worked with Canadian higher education, started assessing international academic programs in terms of how much money they brought in and their direct influence on Canada's trade relations. Johnston Elite called this shift in education from a position as public good to, Johnston Elite called this shift in education from a position as public good to education as a commodity. The fact that the internationalization of higher education resides currently under the Ministry of does not reside currently under the Ministry of Education, but rather under the Ministry of Trade, is of particular note for Johnston and Lee. Could the commercial interests of internationalization be any more explicit? With this new emphasis on the economic gains of internationalization, it quickly became necessary to elevate Canada's international brand in order to compete for international students and the monetary and intellectual resources they bring into the country. Knight observes, whereas projects once worked to build capacity through international cooperation, now they began to be replaced by initiatives that worked to build the status of the university and help the institution gain world-class recognition. What is the human cost of this kind of shift in perspective? Risby and Lingard argue that the economic turn in internationalization has situated students as human capital, where institutions are interested primarily in producing graduates with the skills and knowledge that can benefit the Canadian economy, trade, security, and global competitiveness. But this is different than the partnership model that once anchored Canadian internationalization. Knight says that in the early to mid-20th century, internationalization in Canadian higher education was about hosting students from developing countries who would receive an education here and then return to their home countries to contribute to nation-building projects there, but not anymore. Johnston and Lee say that because of this economic turn, this emphasis on branding and global competitiveness, Canada is now contributing to a global, quote, brain drain, wherein developed country siphons the resources of a developing country. By recruiting and enrolling international students, Canada gains high-skilled labor trained and educated at the student's expense or the expense of the sending country. Furthermore, the source country loses bright and innovative workers and thinkers from their next generation. One can almost hear the regret in Desai Trulokeko's words when she writes, ironically, for a country that established a bold and unique international vision, one observes an alignment with broader global approaches that result in a narrowing of vision. A vision focused on the consolidation of Canada's security, wealth, and power as a developed country. So if this is true, if what Lingard, Rizvi, Johnstone, Lee, and Knight all write is correct, that the new economic turn behind internationalization is resituating the student as human capital valuable only for the economic boost they bring to the university and Canada's trade relations, then my question is, has that changed the way that we are creating and administrating our writing courses? By conducting a case study of 3 universities, University of British Columbia, University of Alberta, and University of Waterloo, I'm doing a content analysis of their internationalization materials as well as their writing program materials with the intent of discovering if the shift in internationalization has led to a shift in the way each university situates international students and teaches them writing. Ultimately, my argument is not with internationalization for economic gain in and of itself. Institutions need money in order to stay open, generate research, and move knowledge forward. Internationalization offers a way to keep our doors open. It also offers new possibilities for theory, research, and praxis around diverse classrooms constituting multiple cultures and languages. My concern lies with the way in which commercial interests may shift our perspective of the students we are enrolling and how we situate them in the writing classroom. Internationalization offers some important benefits to higher education. I would argue that these benefits lie not solely in the realm of economic gain, but in the plurality of language and culture it brings to our intellectual pursuits. But because of this, internationalization requires that we pay close attention to how it may be influencing our ethos. As Jane Knight writes, practice and policy need to be closely examined in terms of what values and purposes are driving internationalization. The same is true for the field of composition and writing studies in Canada. While internationalization opens exciting opportunities for theory and pedagogy in the composition classroom, it's important to be aware of how the commercial interest driving modern internationalization shapes the ethos and values of the field, most acutely, how it shapes the way we position our students within the writing classroom, which is often used to assimilate them to the larger culture of the institution. Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague and fellow presenter, Brittany Edmansky. Brittany is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology and Legal Studies. Her mixed methods research examines the career transitions of graduate students within and outside of academia and what affects these transitions.
Good afternoon, everyone. So the title of my presentation today is Career Pressures and Pathways of Social Science PhDs. And the question that I'd like us to reflect on throughout my grad talk is, what is the role of the university in preparing PhDs for their eventual careers? I thought I'd start out with a little bit of lighthearted humor in case anybody else is as big of a PhD comic fan as I am. So what I'll get to is that I think this resonates with a lot of our journeys during the PhD. So as per the comic, the plans. The plan you tell your advisor, I'm going to become a professor at a major research university after I graduate. The real plan, look for career alternatives. The secret plan, become a baker, rock star, or writer. And the reason that I think this resonates with many of us, myself included, is that a lot of us intend when we begin our PhD to pursue academic employment. That is the golden ticket and what we've been trained to do. However, many of us start to recognize the difficulty with securing this employment at some point during our PhD. And from there, it often leads to some sort of panic and a scramble to figure out alternatives either before or after graduation. Which leads us into what our problem is. So as we can see with the left pie chart, this comes from Conference Board of Canada data. It says that 32% of people are employed within the academic sector, any of those who have obtained a PhD. However, what this is telling us is that the majority, 68% of PhDs, are not obtaining a career within academia. When we look at the pie chart on the right, this comes from my previous research. When we narrow down what constitutes an academic position, so rather than including any part-time, any contract employment, we're not including teaching assistants, research assistants, sessional instructors, we're only including those who obtained a full-time, permanent position as a professor. Only 14% of PhDs were able to do so within 2 years of their graduation. So what I identify as the problem here is that we're preparing our PhDs for academic careers, and oftentimes other sectors can be seen as a backup plan. So we aren't necessarily preparing our students for these other sectors of employment. However, as we can see from these charts, this is where the majority of our graduates are obtaining their careers. So we're preparing them for a field that they aren't necessarily going to obtain their employment within. Now, in terms of the context of this problem, starting at the top, there was significant expansion of graduate education beginning in the early 2000s with certain policies such as the Reaching Higher initiative. What this did is skewed the supply and demand of graduate students, which contributed to market saturation of the academic sector. However, only recently have we begun to consider what effect this market saturation has had on the academic sector. So that's where we're seeing media and policy starting to consider what jobs are available beyond academia, how do we foster the career awareness of PhDs for these sectors, and how do we develop their professional development skills during their PhD to prepare them for versatile career pathways. So my argument is that this introduces the debate of what the purpose of a PhD is. Is the purpose of a PhD knowledge for knowledge's sake, or is the purpose of a PhD for the eventual career? This then leads into my research, which was conducted in 3 main phases. The first of which analyzed government data from Statistics Canada. It used the 2013 National Graduate Survey and Survey of Earned Doctorates. However, what I noticed with this is that although it provided an introduction, a lay of the land to PhDs in general, so humanities, social sciences, and hard sciences, and what their career outcomes were, there was a largely overlooked population, which introduces what I talk about in my primary data in phase 2 and phase 3. So what these phases did is focused in on social science PhDs and what their career outcomes are. More specifically, the focus of today's talk is on phase 3. And so as we'll soon see in a few slides, I've grabbed excerpts from interviews that I've conducted with these participants to speak more largely to the career development or professional development that students had during their degrees. And such, I think it's important to note at this point before we move into findings, most of my findings today speak generally to Canadian institutions. It's not necessarily aimed specifically at Waterloo, as Waterloo is already far ahead in terms of being career-oriented relative to other universities. However, once we get to the recommendations, I'll specify which are for general Canadian institutions in general, versus which is for Waterloo. So I wanted to start out with this slide first, as it speaks more generally to the careers that my participants reported outside of academia. What were their most common careers? This was it. Many reported careers as either an analyst, a consultant, a clinical psychologist, a research facilitator, a project manager, and a researcher. And the reason why I present this slide is that I find it's important to identify what careers our graduates are obtaining. Oftentimes, workshops, advisors, other mentors, etc., aim at preparing PhDs' job application materials, but we don't necessarily focus or hone in on what jobs we should be tailoring or presenting these job applications to. And so the next two slides, we get into some of the data that I talked earlier about. So before moving into these quotes, I just wanted to mention that I will identify what each of these quotes are, and we'll take a couple of seconds to reflect on each before moving on to what the broader theme is. So my first quote from Teresa, and of course both participant names have been changed, who obtained her PhD in psychology in 2011, said, "If you're not choosing academia as your primary path, then you should be quiet about it, otherwise people will judge you." And so what I think Teresa and what other respondents of my research identified is the norm of the pursuit of academic employment and how most of their career preparation during the PhD surrounded preparing them for this job. It's what their supervisors had done. It's what their supervisors had done. They were the next generation expected to pursue the same employment outcome. However, where we start to run into trouble is that other career pathways were in some cases stigmatized as what respondents identified as a backup plan and were seen as less prestigious than pursuing academic employment. And so the consequences of this will be discussed on the next slide. So as stated by Margaret, and what I think is important to note here is how recently Margaret obtained her PhD in 2017. And she mentioned, "I wish I had more time to think of other options. I don't think I really had time to think about what other things might interest me during the PhD." And so what I believe is important to note here, as said by Margaret, among other respondents, is that as a result of their narrow career focus, many PhDs lacked an awareness of the other feasible careers available to them once they graduated. As a result, some graduates fell into what's called the sessional trap. So graduates pursue employment, contract employment as a sessional instructor for a number of years in hopes of obtaining permanent academic employment. Or in other cases, many scramble to develop their career awareness and skills articulation after graduation rather than during their program. And so as a result of these considerations, I've come up with 3 recommendations, the first 2 of which are aimed at Canadian institutions more generally, and the third of which is aimed at Waterloo as a next step. My first recommendation is to foster more versatile career awareness during the PhD. My argument here is that departments may not necessarily be the most well-suited to do so, as faculty are often experts in academia, but they aren't necessarily always experts in other fields and other employment sectors. And so my argument is, like we have at the University of Waterloo, some of the onus should be taken by more career-oriented departments, like the Center for Career Action, like Graduate Studies and Postdoctoral Affairs, and so forth. These sorts of departments should be implemented at other institutions and should be taking on at least a portion of that work. Once we start to look at these workshops that are being offered at institutions, my other argument is that we need to be enacting a show, not tell process. So rather than telling students that they have transferable skills, it's important to help them explicitly identify and articulate what those skills are so they can be tailoring that in their job applications, in their interview process, and so forth. My second recommendation is to deepen industry, or more specifically employer, understanding of PhD skill sets. As reported by my respondents, oftentimes employers only really understood, or they only felt that they understood, what skills were imparted by a PhD when the hiring manager had a PhD or had a graduate degree themselves. Those who reported that their hiring manager had no background with a graduate degree often felt that they had to work a lot harder to articulate what their skills were. And so my argument is that this can be mitigated by both the student and the employer. So first off, the student can be creating or revising their elevator pitch for employers. So thinking about what we have on campus here, like the 3-minute thesis and otherwise, Instead of talking about something that's jargon within your own department, thinking about how to articulate what it is that you've done to a broader audience, what the transferable skills that you've been working on during your degree are, and most importantly, I argue most importantly, why that matters to that specific company. Why should they care? In terms of what can be done on behalf of employer, I argue that there's many different initiatives that they can be taken, but I think one of the most feasible is to introduce employer lunch and learns, especially on campuses like Waterloo, where we already have such tight links to employers. So helping employers understand what PhDs can be doing across campuses in the hard sciences, in the social sciences, in the humanities. And my final recommendation, the one that's aimed particularly and specifically at Waterloo as a next step, is to expand work-integrated learning among graduate programs. As I found in my research, few universities and few programs have included graduate-level work-integrated learning or WIL opportunities. Yet, as indicated by my respondents, even though few of them obtained WIL experiences during their PhD, only about 3 out of 28 of those that I interviewed, all 3 cases spoke to how beneficial those opportunities were for them during their PhD. In all cases, it helped them to increase their social networks during their degree, and they were able to use that work-integrated learning opportunity as a stepping stone to permanent employment upon graduation. So to conclude, we revisit the question, what is the role of the university in preparing PhDs for careers? I argue that it stems from the 3 recommendations presented here: fostering versatile career awareness, fostering employer awareness of a PhD skill set, and expanding graduate work-integrated learning opportunities. However, I think it's important to note that the initiative isn't solely the responsibility of the university. It falls on the students as well. But I argue that university accountability will help increase student awareness of the jobs that are available to them, and it acts as a stepping stone to promote student initiative. Thank you for your time.